There is a swimming pool behind a large house in New Jersey, and for a few weeks one spring, a family of wild ducks decided to live in it. They landed one morning without asking anyone, the way ducks do, and they stayed. They swam in slow circles. They dozed on the warm concrete at the shallow end, and the man who owned the house, a heavy, balding man in his early 40s in a bathrobe holding a plate of bread, began going out to feed them every single day. Before anything else, before the phone calls, before the driving, before the parts of his life he did not talk about at dinner. He built them a small wooden ramp so the ducklings could get in and out. He stood in the water in his robe, waist deep, arms out, entirely still, waiting for them to come close. And then, at the end of that spring, the ducks did what ducks do. They rose off the water all at once and flew away. And the man watched them go, and something inside him came loose, and he fell down on the concrete beside his own swimming pool, unable to breathe. That is the opening of the most influential television series ever made. Not a shootout, not a betrayal. A man having a panic attack because some birds left his pool. Tonight we're going to spend a long, slow while with that show, and with the strange, quiet idea at the center of it. The idea that a violent man might sit in a chair once a week and try to explain himself to a stranger, and that this might be more interesting to watch than anything he did with his hands. If you're here to fall asleep, this is a good moment to let yourself settle. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been sitting all day. Nothing in the next hour or so needs anything from you. You can follow it closely, or let it blur into background, or fall asleep in the middle and never learn how it ends. All three are fine. That's what this is for. Before we go on, one small thing, and then I won't interrupt again. If this voice helps you get to sleep tonight, leaving a like costs you nothing and helps other people who are lying awake right now find their way here. And if you'd like this to be here again tomorrow night, you can subscribe. That's all. Now let's not think about any of that again, and let's go back to the man in the bathrobe. His name is Tony Soprano, and he does not exist. He was written by a man called David Chase, who had spent about 20 years at that point writing for American network television, competent, professional, mostly forgettable work on shows that came and went, and who had wanted the entire time to be making films instead. Chase grew up in New Jersey in an Italian-American family. He had a difficult mother. He had, at various points in his adult life, been in therapy himself. And somewhere in the mid-90s, he had an idea for a film about a mobster who goes to a psychiatrist because his mother is driving him out of his mind. He took it around. Nobody wanted it. It sat. And then it went almost by accident to a cable channel called HBO, which at that point was known mostly for films you'd already seen, boxing, and a certain amount of late-night programming nobody discussed at work. HBO had begun making a little original television, tentatively. They read the script, they agreed to pay for a single pilot episode filmed in the summer of 1997, and then they sat on it for months before deciding, that December, to actually make the show. It went on the air on the 10th of January 1999 to an audience of fewer than 4 million people, a number so small that on ordinary American television at the time it would have been considered a quiet failure. It ran for 6 seasons, 86 episodes. It ended in June of 2007. And in between, it did something that people are still, 25 years later, arguing about the exact size of. It changed what television was allowed to be. Let your breathing slow a little here. There's no urgency to any of this. To understand why it mattered, you have to remember what television was before it, which is genuinely hard to do now because the change was so complete that the old world is difficult to picture. Before this show, American drama followed rules that were almost never broken, not because anyone had written them down, but because the entire economic structure of the medium depended on them. Television was paid for by advertisers. Advertisers wanted audiences who felt comfortable. Comfortable audiences wanted heroes who were good, villains who were bad, and problems that were solved by the end of the hour so you could watch the next episode in any order without confusion. Characters did not change much. They could not, because episodes were sold to be repeated forever in any sequence. The doctor was decent this week and decent next week. The detective had a flaw, but it was a manageable flaw, the kind that made him charming. Nothing carried over that couldn't be explained in 30 seconds. Nobody was allowed to be genuinely unpleasant for very long because unpleasant people don't sell washing powder. And film. Film was where the serious work happened. That was simply understood. Actors did television when they were young and needed the money, or old and no longer being offered films. A film was art. Television was furniture. It was the thing that was on. The show we're talking about arrived and quietly refused nearly all of that, and the reason it could was almost entirely structural rather than artistic. HBO was paid for by subscription. There were no advertisers to keep comfortable. Nobody needed a happy ending to sell anything afterward. That single financial fact opened a door, and Chase walked through it with a story about a man who does terrible things, feels genuinely bad about some of them, gets better in certain ways and worse in others, and never once resolves. The audience was asked to sit with someone they could not entirely condemn and could not possibly approve of, week after week, for 8 years. That had not really been done before at that scale, and the mechanism that made it bearable, the thing that let you stay in the room with him, was the therapy. Because here's the structural trick, and it's a beautiful one. If a man simply commits crimes, you watch him from outside, and you either enjoy it or you don't. But if that same man sits in a chair once a week and tries to explain himself to a psychiatrist, you're suddenly inside his head, hearing his version, watching him lie to her and occasionally to himself, and noticing the gap between what he says and what you saw him do 20 minutes earlier. You become, without ever agreeing to it, a kind of second therapist. You're assessing him. You're catching him out. You're occasionally, uncomfortably, feeling sorry for him. That's not a plot device. That's an entire relationship between a show and its viewer, and it had essentially not existed on television before. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. You don't need to hold on to any of this. The psychiatrist has a name, Dr. Jennifer Melfi, and the actress who played her, Lorraine Bracco, had been offered the other major female role first, the wife. She turned it down. She had already played a mob wife, memorably, in a famous film a decade earlier, and she did not want to repeat herself, so she asked for the therapist instead, which meant that the two women at the center of the show were both played by people making deliberate, slightly awkward choices about what they wanted their careers to be. And there is a lovely, strange fact about the casting of that show that says something about the world it came out of. 27 of its cast members had appeared in a single film, Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas from 1990. 27, an entire ecosystem of Italian-American actors from New York and New Jersey who had spent years playing versions of the same handful of parts in films, suddenly gathered into one long-running television series where they were finally allowed to be tired and bored and worried about their children's college applications, and afraid of getting older, in between everything else. The man at the center of it, the one in the bathrobe with the bread, was played by an actor almost nobody outside the industry could have named in 1998. James Gandolfini was a character actor from New Jersey. He was not conventionally handsome. He was overweight, balding, rough-edged, with a heavy accent. Everything the American television industry had spent 50 years deciding a leading man was not. He had been noticed years earlier because a casting director saw a brief clip of him in a film and thought, him, that's the man. What he did with the part is difficult to describe to somebody who hasn't seen it, and I'm going to try anyway, because it's the reason the whole thing worked. He played a man who was frightening and exhausted at the same time, not alternately, simultaneously. You could see in a single expression somebody capable of doing something terrible and somebody who very much did not want to get out of bed. He made a man who lies constantly seem transparent. He let you see the child inside the middle-aged body, sulking, wounded, wanting his mother to be different than she was, and he never once asked you to forgive any of it. He won 3 Emmy Awards for it, and by the end he was reportedly being paid $1 million an episode, which for television at that time was an almost unimaginable figure. He also, by many accounts, found it genuinely difficult to carry. Living inside that particular man for 8 years, being asked to summon that specific darkness on schedule, was not a comfortable job, and he was open at times about how much it cost him. There's something worth sitting with in that. The performance that convinced an entire industry that television could be art was also, for the person giving it, a weight. Let your jaw unclench if it's tightened. Let the breath go out slowly. We should talk about the mother, because the mother is where the whole thing started. David Chase's original idea, the one he couldn't sell as a film, was specifically about a man whose mother was making him miserable. Not a crime story with a mother in it. a mother story with crime in it. And when the show finally existed, the character of Tony's mother, Livia, was written with a coldness that audiences found genuinely shocking, because it was so much smaller and more ordinary than the violence around it. She was not a monster in any operatic sense. She was a difficult, self-pitying, manipulative elderly woman who could ruin an afternoon with a single sentence and then deny she'd said anything at all. She complained. She withheld. She rewrote history in her favor, constantly, and with total conviction. Chase has said, more or less openly over the years, that she was based on his own mother. That's an extraordinary thing to put on television. Not a fictional villain, but a recognizable person from your own life, rendered so precisely that millions of viewers wrote in to say they knew her. They had one. She was their mother too. And it explains the show's oddest and most important quality. The violence in it is professional and almost impersonal, but the family scenes are where the real damage happens. A man who is genuinely dangerous in the world is completely defenseless at his mother's kitchen table. That inversion is the joke and the tragedy of the whole thing at once. The actress who played her, Nancy Marchand, was in her 70s and seriously ill through the filming, and died before the story was finished, which left the writers with a problem they solved awkwardly and never entirely recovered from. But by then the point had been made. The most powerful man in the room is not the one holding the gun. It's the small old woman on the sofa saying she doesn't want to be a burden. Breathe out. There's nothing to decide here. Let's talk about the pace of it, because this is the part that connects most directly to why you might be listening to something like this at this hour. The show was slow. Genuinely, sometimes maddeningly slow by the standards of what came before it. Whole episodes would pass in which very little happened in the plot sense. People ate, argued about nothing, drove around New Jersey, sat in the back of a shop, had a conversation that went nowhere, and then a different conversation that also went nowhere. There is a famous episode where two characters get lost in the woods in the snow and simply stay lost, and it resolves nothing. And it is regularly named as one of the best hours of television ever broadcast. That slowness was a deliberate argument. Chase came from film, and he believed television had trained audiences to expect constant incident, because incident is what fills the gaps between advertisements. Take away the advertisements, and you can let a scene breathe. You can let people be boring at each other, because real people are boring at each other, and because a story that moves at the speed of a life feels different from a story that moves at the speed of a plot. Nearly everything that followed learned this lesson. The long, quiet stretch before something happens is now standard grammar in serious television, to the point where it's invisible. It was not invisible in 1999. It was startling, and a certain number of viewers found it infuriating. There's a version of that same argument in what you're listening to right now, incidentally. Slowness as a deliberate choice. Nothing that demands you keep up. Let the room go soft. Let your hands go heavy. The show also did something with the ordinary details of a life that almost no drama had bothered with. The characters worried about property values. They went to the dentist. They fought about school fees and holidays and whether the pool needed servicing. One of the running quiet threads of the entire series is a man in his 40s, gradually understanding that his body is failing. His blood pressure, his weight, his knees, the sheer physical effort of continuing to be who he has decided to be. That's the part that people who love the show tend to talk about when they've had a few years to think about it. Not the crime. The reality of being middle-aged. The specific grinding awareness that you have become the person you are going to be. That your children are turning into strangers with opinions. That your parents are dying or already dead. That the life you built is heavy and you are the only one holding it up. You can see why it took hold. You can also see why it took several seasons for the audience to grow. Because none of that is what anybody had been promised. Let's stay in that for a moment, in the quiet, because it's a genuinely soothing thought to hold at this hour, an enormously popular, enormously influential piece of art whose actual subject was a tired man in his 40s trying to work out why he was unhappy in a life that, from the outside, appeared to have everything in it. The awards came slowly, and then all at once. In its first year, it was nominated for the biggest prize in American television, the first time a cable series had ever been nominated in that category at all, and it lost to a network legal drama that almost nobody remembers now. It would take until 2004 for it to actually win, becoming the first cable drama in history to do so, By the end of the run, it had won 21 Emmy Awards from over 100 nominations, plus Golden Globes, plus 2 Peabody Awards, which are given for broadcasting of genuine public significance, rather than mere popularity. But awards aren't really the measure of what happened. The measure is that everything downstream of it looks different. The showrunner behind Breaking Bad, and if you've listened to me before, you know I've spent an evening with that one already, said it plainly. Without Tony Soprano, there would be no Walter White. Mad Men was created by a writer who worked on The Sopranos. The Wire, The Shield, Game of Thrones, virtually every serious cable drama of the following 2 decades exists in a landscape that this one show cleared. It made television a place where the best writers wanted to be. It made film actors stop turning it down. It created the entire idea, now completely ordinary, that the most ambitious storytelling of a given decade might be happening on a screen in somebody's living room, rather than in a cinema. Let that settle. Nothing to do with it. Just a fact resting quietly in the dark. Let's spend a while in the world of it, because the place mattered as much as the people, and it's a good landscape to drift through. Almost everything was filmed where it was set. Not on a soundstage in California with a few establishing shots flown in, which was the standard practice. Actually in New Jersey, in real houses, in real diners, on real roads. The production took over an enormous suburban house for the family home. The shop where the men sat around all day was a real shop. The road you see in the opening credits is an actual road, and people who live near it still drive it every day. That decision changed the texture of the whole thing. Television before it had a particular quality of nowhereness, interiors that could be anywhere, streets that were clearly a studio backlot with the same corner reused. This had weather in it. It had a specific ugly beauty. Refineries, overpasses, chain restaurants, enormous houses with too much marble, strip malls, the turnpike, the low-gray New Jersey sky. Nobody had bothered to make that landscape look like anything before, because it wasn't considered a place worth filming. The opening title sequence is just a man driving home. 2.5 minutes of it. Toll booth, industrial towers, a cemetery, bridges, then gradually greener and richer as he moves out of the city and into the suburbs, ending in the driveway of a very large house. No dialogue, nothing happens. It plays at the start of all 86 episodes, unchanged, and by the end it functions almost like a piece of liturgy. You know exactly what's coming, in order, and the familiarity is the point. If you want to understand what a show is about, it's often worth looking at what it puts in its title sequence. This one chose a man, alone, in a car, arriving at the life he has built. Not the crime, not the family, the commute. Let yourself sink a little further. There's nothing to keep hold of here. The people around him are worth some slow time too, because the show's real achievement was building a world where 20 or 30 characters all felt like they had lives continuing off-screen. The wife was played by Edie Falco, who won 3 Emmy Awards for it, the same as her co-star. The role could very easily have been nothing, the worried woman at the kitchen table, wringing her hands while the men do things. Instead, it became one of the most uncomfortable and interesting portraits of complicity ever put on television. She knows. Of course she knows. She has always known. And she has built an entire architecture of not quite knowing, of asking no follow-up questions, of directing her considerable intelligence and energy into the house, the children, the church, the appearance of a life, all of it paid for by the things she has decided not to look at directly. There are scenes where she confronts it, and scenes where she constructs elaborate reasons not to, and the show is scrupulously honest about how much easier the second is. Anybody who has ever benefited from something they preferred not to examine will find her difficult to watch, which is, obviously, the point. Then there's the younger man, the protege, the nephew figure, played by Michael Imperioli, who is the show's saddest running argument. He wants to be a writer. He genuinely does. There's a whole thread about him trying to write a screenplay, badly, in between the rest of his life, and the show treats that ambition with a mixture of tenderness and cruelty that's hard to describe. He's not talented enough, but he wants it, which is more than anyone around him wants anything. And the tragedy is that the world he's in has no mechanism for wanting things that aren't money. And there's a piece of casting so unlikely, it's worth a few minutes on its own. One of the central figures, the boss's consigliere, his advisor, the man who stands beside him in almost every scene, was played by Steven Van Zandt, who was not an actor at all. He was a musician. Specifically, he was the guitarist in Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band, and had been for decades. He had never acted professionally in his life. Chase had seen him give a speech at a Music Hall of Fame ceremony, thought he was funny and strange and completely himself, and decided he wanted him in the show. The network was, understandably, unenthusiastic about handing a major role to a rock guitarist. A part was created for him that hadn't existed in the original plan, and he turned out to be excellent, playing a man of immense stillness and dry humor, mostly by standing very quietly and reacting, which is an extremely difficult thing to do on camera, and which he had somehow been doing on stage next to a very loud singer for 25 years. There's something lovely about that. A man who had spent his whole life being the person slightly to the left of the spotlight, cast as a man whose entire job is to be the person slightly to the left of the boss. Let the breath go long and slow now. There's another small piece of the world worth wandering through. The houses. Everyone in the story lives in an enormous suburban house, and the show is extremely interested in these houses, the marble, the columns, the wall-to-wall carpet, the furniture that cost a great deal and communicates nothing except that it cost a great deal. Characters give tours of them. They compare kitchens. Somebody is always renovating. That's a class observation, delivered without commentary. These are people with a lot of money and no inherited language for spending it. The house is the trophy and the proof and the reason for everything, and it is also, in every visible detail, slightly wrong. Too much, too new, arranged for display rather than for living in. And there's a lovely tension in how the show films them. Enormous rooms, expensively furnished, almost always mostly empty. One person at a huge table, someone alone in a kitchen designed for a party. The scale of the houses makes the loneliness in them visible without anyone having to say a word about it. If you've ever been in a room that was too big for the number of people in it, you know the specific quality of that silence. The show found it and used it for 8 years. Let that image sit quietly for a moment. A large, warm, over-furnished house, late at night, mostly dark, one lamp on downstairs. We should talk about the food, because the food is genuinely one of the reasons people find the show comforting, which is a strange sentence to write about a crime drama. There is an enormous amount of eating in it. Sunday dinners, long tables, bakery boxes tied with string, coffee constantly. Characters cook on screen in real time, and the recipes are correct. There was eventually an official cookbook, because so many viewers wanted to make the food. Whole plot points turn on who was invited to dinner and who wasn't, on whether somebody brought something, on the specific insult of arriving empty-handed. That's not decoration. In a story about a group of people whose actual business is unspeakable, the meals are where the culture lives. The part that's genuinely warm, genuinely inherited, genuinely worth something. The show is clear-eyed about the fact that the same tradition producing the Sunday table is producing everything else, and it doesn't let you separate them. But it also lets the table be lovely. It films the food the way other shows film sunsets. If you've ever found yourself watching a series mostly for the feeling of a room full of people eating and arguing, that's the mechanism. It's the oldest comfort there is. Someone has cooked, everyone is here, the conversation is loud, and for the length of the meal, nothing bad is happening. Let that image stay for a moment. A long table, warm light, voices overlapping. Nothing required of you. Then there's the language, which had a strange second life of its own. The show's specific Italian-American New Jersey dialect, the compressed pronunciations, the food words worn down over 3 generations until they barely resembled the original Italian, entered the wider culture and stayed there. People who have never seen a single episode use phrases from it. The particular way certain characters said certain dishes became a kind of shorthand that outlasted the series by decades, drifting into internet culture, into memes, into the speech of people born after the show ended. That's an odd form of immortality. Not the plot, not the characters, but the sound of the thing. The way people talked. It happened partly because the cast were largely genuinely from that world. Not actors doing an accent. People who had grown up with those cadences, being allowed to use them at length, on a major series, without being asked to soften anything for a national audience. There's a specificity in it that can't be faked, and audiences can always tell. Let your hands go heavy. Let the pillow take all of it. There's one more formal oddity worth describing, because it's the thing that most divided the audience at the time, and that most influenced everything afterward. The dreams. Every so often the show would simply stop being a realistic drama and become something else entirely for 10 or 20 minutes. The character would fall asleep and the episode would follow them into a dream. Properly strange dreams. Illogical. Symbolic. Occasionally frightening. Full of people who had died and animals that talked and places that shifted. There was an entire episode, one of the most famous, that took place almost entirely inside a delirium. A man in a hotel in a town he didn't recognize, with a different name and a different job, unable to get home, unable to explain himself to anyone. Network television did not do this. It was considered a catastrophic risk to spend a whole hour of an expensive series on something the audience might find pretentious, and a certain number of viewers absolutely did. Those episodes generated furious complaints every single time. But they established something that's now completely normal, which is that a serious television drama is allowed to be strange, allowed to have passages that don't advance anything, that operate on feeling rather than event, that ask you to sit inside a mood. Almost every prestige drama since has its equivalent, the surreal episode, the dream, the departure from format, and it traces back here. And they were the show's honest way of dealing with its own subject. A story about a man in therapy, in which we're constantly weighing what he says against what's true, obviously belongs partly in the unconscious. The dreams were where the character couldn't lie. Rest a little deeper now. Let it all blur. One more thing about the dreams before we move on, because there's a practical detail in them that's oddly relevant to what you're doing right now. The show understood something about sleep that most drama gets wrong. In films, dreams are usually tidy, clearly symbolic, easy to decode, obviously a dream. In this series, they're often almost indistinguishable from ordinary scenes for the first minute or two. Somebody is in a room having a normal conversation, and then a detail is wrong, and then another, and only gradually do you realize where you are. That's much closer to how it actually feels. The strangeness arrives slowly, and you accept an enormous amount before you notice anything is odd. And afterwards, you can't reconstruct the moment it turned. Which is, if you're still following me at this hour, quite likely to happen to you at some point in the next stretch of this recording. My voice will keep going. Some of it will make it in. Some of it will get rearranged into something that isn't quite what I said. And you won't notice the moment it turns, because nobody ever does. That's fine. That's what this is for. Let your breathing go slower still. The most beloved single episode of the whole run is one where two of the men drive out to the pine forests in the south of the state on a small errand and become lost in the snow. That's it. That's the episode. They get lost, they get cold, they argue, they fail to find their way back for an unreasonable length of time. It was directed by Steve Buscemi, who directed several episodes over the years and later joined the cast. It's regularly voted the best hour of the series and sometimes the best hour of television, full stop. And the reason is precisely that nothing in it matters to the larger story. Two men, exhausted, in a wood, being extremely stupid and extremely funny and slightly close to dying. It resolves almost nothing. The question the episode raises is never answered anywhere in the remaining 5 years of the show, deliberately, because Chase thought resolving it would be a lie about how life works. An entire generation of viewers has therefore spent 20 years waiting for an answer that was never going to come, which, if you've been listening this whole time, you will recognize as the same trick as the ending, performed years earlier as a rehearsal. Let all of that soften and drift. There's a whole quiet layer of the series about aging that deserves a slow few minutes, because it's the thing that creeps up on people who rewatch it later in their own lives. Nearly every older character is in some stage of decline, and the show refuses to make any of it dignified. There's a man in his 80s losing his memory, furious about it, becoming a danger and a burden, and occasionally, briefly, entirely himself again. There are hospital corridors, and the specific fluorescent boredom of waiting in them. There are conversations about care homes conducted in the language of doing what's best for someone, by people who are plainly doing what's easiest for themselves. And running through it is the middle-aged man in the center, watching all of it, doing the arithmetic, understanding that this is the queue he's standing in, Television at the time did not really do this. Older characters were wise or comic or briefly ill before a resolution. Here the aging is slow, undignified, expensive, and unresolved, and everybody involved handles it badly, which is how it usually goes. It's a strange thing to describe as comforting, and yet people consistently do. There's a relief in seeing something shown honestly that's usually shown falsely. The recognition that if it's difficult for everyone, then finding it difficult isn't a personal failure. Let that go soft now. It's not a tonight problem. Let's talk about the money. Because the business story underneath all of this is the reason the art was possible, and it's a genuinely calming thing to think through slowly. American television for 50 years worked like this. A network broadcast free programs and sold the attention of the people watching to companies who wanted to advertise. That's the whole model. It means the customer was never the viewer. The customer was the advertiser, and the product being sold was you. Everything about the medium followed from that. Programs had to be interruptible every 11 minutes, which shaped the structure of every story ever told on it. They had to avoid offending anybody who might buy anything, which shaped the content. They had to attract the largest possible number of people, rather than the most devoted, because advertisers pay by the head. Excellence was not the goal. Broad acceptability was the goal, and those are very different things, and they produce very different art. Subscription television inverted every part of that. If people pay a monthly fee to have the channel at all, then the question is no longer, will the largest number of people tolerate this, but will enough people love this so much that they keep paying? Those two questions produce opposite answers. The first rewards the inoffensive. The second rewards the specific, the difficult, the thing you'd mention to a friend. That's the actual engine of everything people call the golden age of television. Not a sudden influx of talent. The talent had always been there, doing what the format allowed. A change in who was paying. The show became the most financially successful series in the history of cable television, and it did so with a slow, morally uncomfortable drama about a depressed, middle-aged man, which no advertiser-funded network on Earth would have commissioned. That's the whole lesson in one sentence. And it's worth noticing, from where we sit now, that this arrangement was temporary. The structure that produced it lasted maybe 25 years before shifting into something else again. The streaming era, with its own economics and its own pressures, which reward different things. Chase himself, at the show's 25th anniversary, said something that got a lot of attention. He suggested the celebration should perhaps be treated as a funeral instead, and that television was being dumbed back down. Whether he's right is genuinely arguable. But the fact that the man who benefited most from that window thinks the window has closed is at least worth putting on the record. Let your breathing follow that slowness. In and out. Longer. There was controversy at the time, and it deserves an honest few minutes rather than being skipped. Italian-American organizations objected to the show, publicly and repeatedly throughout its run. The complaint was not complicated. Here was the most acclaimed, most discussed television program in the country, and it depicted Italian-Americans as criminals, again, as they had been depicted for most of the century in American film. One community, one profession, endlessly. Groups protested. There were attempts to block filming in certain locations. Some public officials refused to cooperate with the production. The defenders answered in the usual ways, that it was one story about one family, not a documentary. That the show contained many Italian-American characters with entirely ordinary lives, that the psychiatrist herself, its moral center, was Italian-American, and repeatedly said out loud on screen that these men were an insult to the community. That last point is real. The show argued with itself about this, in dialogue on purpose. Both positions have weight, and the argument was never settled, and it's not going to be settled tonight in the dark. But it's a useful reminder that the shows we now describe as universally beloved masterpieces were, at the time, contested things that a lot of people found genuinely objectionable, for reasons they could articulate clearly. Nothing in culture arrives already agreed upon. It just eventually stops being argued about, which people then mistake for agreement. Let that go now. Nothing to resolve. Here's something that would have seemed impossible in 2007. The show's largest wave of new viewers arrived more than a decade after it ended, and most of them were not born when it started. Somewhere around 2019 and into the early 20s, a generation in their late teens and 20s discovered it, largely through the internet, and adopted it with an intensity that surprised everyone involved. Clips circulated endlessly. Entire online communities formed around jokes only comprehensible to people who had watched all 86 episodes. Cast members found themselves recognized by people young enough to be their grandchildren. Two of the actors started a podcast re-watching the entire series, and it became enormously popular. The explanations offered at the time were interesting. A generation facing an economy of declining prospects found something recognizable in a story about a man who suspects the good years are behind him and that he's inherited a system that no longer works. The show's slowness became a feature rather than a bug for an audience exhausted by content designed to be consumed in 15-second increments. And there's a simpler reason too. It's funny. People who avoided it for years expecting grim violence were surprised to find that a great deal of it is essentially a comedy about awful men complaining. Whatever the cause, it produced one of the more unusual afterlives in television. A program made for adults in 1999, watched by their children's generation in a completely different world, and read as being about that world instead. There was a prequel film in 2021, set in the 1960s, about the childhood of the man we've been discussing. The younger version of him was played by James Gandolfini's own son, Michael, who was a teenager, and who had to learn to perform a version of a character his late father had made famous, which is either the most beautiful or the most difficult casting decision imaginable, and possibly both. Let all of that settle. Let the room go quiet around it. There's a craft detail worth resting on, because it says a lot about how the thing was actually made. Of 86 episodes, David Chase directed exactly 2, the first and the last. That's an unusual choice. He wrote or co-wrote a great deal more and controlled everything, but he stepped behind the camera only to open and close. There's something almost architectural about it, laying the first stone and the last, and trusting other people with the building in between. And there's a less comfortable statistic from the same list. Across all 86 episodes, exactly 1 was directed by a woman. 1. That's not unusual for American television of that period. It's close to typical. But it's the kind of fact that gets quietly left out of the celebrations, and it's worth saying plainly, because a show that was revolutionary in some directions was entirely conventional in others. Progress in any industry is almost never general. It happens along one axis, while everything else stays exactly where it was. Breathe out. Let the shoulders drop once more. We've talked around the central relationship all night, so let's sit with it directly for a while. The man and his psychiatrist, in a room, once a week, for 8 years. The structure of those scenes almost never changes. 2 chairs, a small table, a window, the same lamp. He arrives, sits heavily, complains about the traffic or the parking, and then, gradually, sometimes only in the last 2 minutes, says something true. What makes them extraordinary is how much they resist drama. There are no breakthroughs of the kind films like no single session where everything is revealed and the music swells. Mostly he deflects. He makes jokes. He gets angry at her for asking. He talks at length about somebody else's problem in order to avoid his own, and she waits and occasionally names what he's doing, and he denies it, and the session ends. That is, of course, what therapy actually looks like. Slow, circular, mostly frustrating, with progress measured over years rather than hours. Nobody had shown that on television before because it's dramatically inert. Chase made it the spine of the entire series anyway. And the show is honest about its limits in a way that still stings. There's a running question, never quite stated, about whether making a violent man more self-aware makes him better or simply more effective, whether understanding your patterns is the same as changing them, whether a person can be genuinely helped by talking, or whether talking is just another thing a person does. It doesn't answer. It just keeps him in the chair. Let all of that go loose now. It's not a question for tonight. One more small thing, and then we'll start to close. The show's most repeated line, the one that became shorthand for the whole thing, was not clever. It was 3 words a mother-in-law might say. It got repeated because it was ordinary, and because the ordinariness sitting next to everything else was the entire joke of the series. That's what people miss when they describe it as a crime drama. Almost none of the memorable material is criminal. It's a man complaining about his sister. It's an argument over a restaurant bill. It's somebody being petty about a gift. It's two people who have known each other for 30 years having the same disagreement they've had 1,000 times. The world it built is memorable because it's furnished. There are recurring restaurants and shops and hospital corridors. Minor characters return 4 seasons later with the grudge they had before. People remember insults for years. It behaves like a place rather than a set, which is why viewers describe rewatching it as visiting somewhere rather than watching something. That's a good thought to drift on. A place you can go back to, where everyone is exactly where you left them, having the same arguments at the same tables forever. Let it soften. Let's go slowly back to the beginning for a while, to the years before any of it existed, because the story of how a thing nearly didn't happen is often the most restful part. David Chase was in his 50s when the show began. That's worth stopping on. He had spent roughly a quarter of a century writing for television he did not particularly respect, on shows that were perfectly decent and are now largely forgotten, waiting for permission to do the thing he actually wanted to do. He had won an Emmy in the late 70s for work on a detective series. He had written for a show about a small town in Alaska. He was, by every external measure, a successful working television writer, and by his own account quietly frustrated for most of it. He wanted to make films. He kept trying. And the idea that eventually became the most influential television series ever made was, first, a film script that nobody would finance. There's something worth resting on in that. The work that changes everything is often the thing somebody made because they'd given up on getting to make the thing they actually wanted. He turned to television because film wouldn't have him, and then reorganized television around his frustration. He has said in interviews, more than once, and with a certain amount of gallows humor, that the show's central subject, a man who feels he arrived too late, after the good years, inheriting the diminished remains of something that used to mean more, was not exactly a coincidence. The pilot was filmed in the summer of 1997, and then sat unaired for months while executives decided whether to proceed. Imagine that. The finished first hour of the thing, existing on tape in a building, while people in offices discussed whether there was any audience for it at all. It was greenlit in December. It went out 13 months later. Let your breath lengthen. There's no hurry in any of this. The casting of the central role took an unusual route as well. The actor had been noticed years earlier because somebody in casting saw a short clip of him in a film, not a leading role, a supporting turn, and remembered him. He was invited to audition. By his own telling in later years, he was uncomfortable with the whole business of auditioning, and there are various accounts of him stopping partway through, dissatisfied with himself, and asking to come back another day. He got the part. And the decision to give the biggest role on a prestige drama to a heavy, balding character actor with no leading man history was, in 1998, genuinely eccentric. It is now completely unremarkable. You can name a dozen enormously successful series built around exactly that kind of actor. But the reason it's unremarkable is that this one worked. That's how these things go. A choice looks obvious in hindsight, precisely because it succeeded, and the strangeness of it at the time gets forgotten. Let all of that settle gently. We should say something about the writer's room, because it's where the texture came from. The show was written by a small group who stayed largely stable across the years, and Chase's method, by most accounts, was to push relentlessly against anything that felt like television. If a scene resolved too neatly, it was rewritten. If a character explained their own motivation out loud, it was cut. If a plot line arrived at the obvious conclusion, they looked for a different one, or simply abandoned it partway through, which infuriated viewers and became one of the series' signatures. Storylines in it frequently go nowhere. A character is introduced with what appears to be enormous significance and then simply recedes. A crisis builds for weeks and then diffuses off-screen. Something that seems designed to matter turns out not to. Audiences trained on conventional structure experienced this as sloppiness. It wasn't. It was a deliberate, sustained argument that plots are a lie we tell about lives. that in reality most things that feel enormous at the time simply subside, and most consequences never arrive, and the significant events are rarely the ones that announce themselves. Whether that makes for better drama is a real question, and people still disagree. But it was a position held consistently for 8 years, at considerable commercial risk. Let that go now. Let it drift out of focus. There's a whole strand of the show about children that's worth a slow few minutes, because it's the part that tends to catch people off guard. The 2 children in the family grow up across the 8 years. Actually grow up, because the actors did, from young teenagers to adults. That's an effect television can produce that almost nothing else can. You watch a person change in real time across the years of your own life. Viewers who watched it live in the early 2000s describe the strange feeling of the children aging alongside their own. And the parents in the story are, underneath everything else, engaged in a project that a great many people will recognize, trying to give their children a life better than the one they had, without being able to explain what they're protecting them from, and slowly realizing that the children will inherit the damage regardless. The daughter goes to a good university and cannot decide how much she wants to know. The son struggles, badly, with depression, in a household where such things are not discussed and are also, obviously, hereditary. The show is unusually careful with that thread. It never treats it as a subplot. The question of whether a person can be raised out of the thing they were born into is arguably the show's real question, the mother version of it, the son version of it, all of it, and the answer it slowly gives is not encouraging. Let your body get heavier. There's nothing here to fix. Something else about the therapy scenes that most people don't notice until a second viewing. They're almost the only place in the entire series where the man is required to sit still. Everywhere else, he is in motion, driving, walking, eating, standing over someone, leaving a room to end a conversation. The therapy is the single environment in 8 years where he cannot escape a subject by physically going somewhere else, and where somebody else controls when it ends. That's why the scenes have the tension they do, despite consisting entirely of 2 people talking quietly in armchairs. He is trapped, voluntarily, once a week, by appointment. He pays for it. He complains about it constantly, and he keeps going back for the better part of a decade, which is the closest thing to hope the show ever offers about him. Whatever else is true, some part of this man keeps returning to a room where he'll be looked at honestly. There's something in that worth carrying toward sleep. Not the character, the pattern. The way a person can be terrible in most directions and still, quietly, keep showing up to the one place where they might be told the truth. Let it soften now. All of it. One more thought before we move toward the close, and it's about why a story like this ends up on a channel like this one at all. There's a reasonable question about whether an hour of narration about a violent television drama belongs in a room where somebody is trying to fall asleep. And the answer, I think, is that almost none of what we've talked about tonight has been violence. It's been a man in a bathrobe with a plate of bread, a writer in his 50s who couldn't sell a film, a guitarist who'd never acted, a family at a long table with too much food, a woman deciding not to ask questions, a slow drive home along the same road 86 times. The crime was always the frame. The furniture inside it was ordinary life, examined more closely than television had bothered to examine it before. And that's the thing worth taking to sleep, if you're taking anything. The most acclaimed drama ever made about dangerous men turned out, on inspection, to be about being tired, and middle-aged, and worried about your children, and unable to talk to your mother, and standing in a swimming pool watching something you love get ready to leave. Let all of it loosen now. We should spend some unhurried time on the ending, because it is probably the single most argued about 90 seconds in the history of the medium, and because, unusually for something so famous, it is genuinely gentle to describe. The last episode went out in June 2007. The final scene is a family arriving, one at a time, at an ordinary ice cream parlor in New Jersey. Not a dramatic location, a diner with booths and a menu and a jukebox on the table. The father arrives first and sits down and flips through the jukebox selections and chooses a song, a big, hopeful, slightly ridiculous American rock song from 1981 about not giving up. The wife arrives. They order. The son arrives. They talk about nothing much, how the day went, an anecdote, the food. Outside, the daughter is trying to park the car and making a mess of it, reversing, straightening, trying again. The camera keeps cutting to the door. Every time it opens, a bell rings, and the father looks up. Other customers come in. A man at the counter, a couple. Nothing happens to any of them. The daughter finally parks, crosses the street, reaches for the door. The bell rings. The father looks up, and the screen goes black. Not a fade, a cut. Instant, total black, in the middle of the song, in the middle of a word. And it stays black for several long seconds, in silence, before the credits eventually roll. An enormous number of people watching it live in 2007 assumed their television had broken. Some of them stood up. Some rang the cable company. The reaction the next day was ferocious. People felt cheated, mocked, robbed of an ending they had waited 8 years for. Message boards collapsed. The writer refused to explain anything. And then, over the following years, the mood turned almost completely around, and it is now widely considered one of the great endings, precisely because of what it refuses to do. Here's the reading that most people arrive at eventually. Throughout the final stretch of the series, there had been a conversation, more than once, about what death would be like. The idea that if it came suddenly, you probably wouldn't hear it. Everything would simply stop, mid-sentence, mid-song, mid-look, and there would be no experience of it at all. Because the thing that experiences would be the thing that stopped. The cut to black puts you inside that. You don't watch him die. You are given his last moment of perception and then nothing, which is the only honest way to film it. Or, alternatively, nothing happens at all, and the show simply stops. Because lives don't have endings shaped like endings, and the writer was making that point with the bluntest possible instrument. Both readings are available. Neither can be confirmed. And the argument has now run for nearly 20 years, which is, when you think about it, an extraordinary afterlife for 90 seconds of a man eating onion rings. Let all of that go soft now. There's no puzzle here you need to solve tonight. Let's stay with the argument about that ending a little longer, because the way people fought about it is more interesting than the ending itself. For weeks afterward, it was the main topic of conversation in an enormous number of households. Newspapers ran opinion pieces. Message boards produced frame-by-frame analyses. People developed elaborate theories involving the placement of characters in the room, the order in which the camera cut, the specific lyric playing at the moment of the cut. Somebody counted the bell rings. Somebody mapped the sightlines. Somebody produced a 30-page document. And the writer said nothing useful, for years, deliberately. He gave interviews in which he declined to explain. He expressed some irritation at being asked. He suggested, at various points, that people were looking at it wrong, without saying what looking at it right would involve. There's a purity in that refusal that's rare. The commercial incentive to explain was enormous. An explanation would have generated another decade of coverage. He simply wouldn't. He had made the thing. Interpreting it was somebody else's job. Years later, in an interview for a book about the series, he said something that appeared to give the answer away. And then there was a small flurry of clarification about what he had actually meant, and the ambiguity survived more or less intact, which is probably the correct outcome. Some things are better as arguments than as answers. What that whole episode demonstrated, though, was something new about the relationship between audiences and television. Nobody had ever cared that much about the last 90 seconds of a TV program. Films had endings people argued about. Television was supposed to conclude neatly and let you get on with your evening. The fact that millions of people felt personally owed a resolution, felt robbed, genuinely aggrieved, was itself proof of what the medium had become in 8 years. You don't feel robbed by furniture. You feel robbed by art you'd committed to. Let all of that drift now. Let it go quiet. There is a sadder ending underneath that one, and it deserves telling gently. 6 years after the show finished, in June 2013, James Gandolfini was on holiday in Rome with his wife and his children, on his way to a film festival in Sicily. He had a heart attack in the hotel. He was 51 years old. The news moved around the world within hours, and in New Jersey, that same night, people began arriving at the ice cream parlor where the last scene had been filmed. an actual working diner, still open, still serving ordinary customers that had never asked to become a landmark. The owner and staff put a reserved sign on the booth where he had sat. People stood outside on the pavement in the dark. There is a photograph of that booth, empty, with the small sign on the table, and it is one of the more affecting images of a fictional character and a real person becoming impossible to separate. He had been, by every account of people who worked with him, an unusually kind man in a role that required him to be the opposite for 8 years. Generous with the crew, uncomfortable with fame, deeply, visibly unlike the person he was famous for being. That's the thing about the work he did. He spent nearly a decade making millions of people believe in the inner life of somebody who did not exist, so completely that when the actor died, the fictional man's empty seat in a real diner became a place where strangers went to stand quietly. Breathe out slowly. Let the shoulders drop again. There's a particular kind of viewer this show created, and it's worth describing slowly because you may recognize it: the rewatcher. The person who has been through all 86 episodes not once but 4 times, 5 times, more, and who is not doing it to find out what happens because they know what happens, but for the company. They put it on while cooking. They fall asleep to it. They have a favorite minor character with about 11 lines. They know which episode to skip to when they want a particular feeling. Long-form television produced this behavior, and it barely existed before. A film ends, and you've had the experience. A series of 86 hours becomes a place you've lived, and returning to it has more in common with going back to a town you used to live in than with watching something. That's a genuinely new relationship between a person and a piece of art, invented more or less by accident in the last 20 to 5 years, and it's one of the reasons this particular series keeps finding new audiences. It's long enough to move into. Let that thought settle in the quiet. A house with 86 rooms, all of them exactly as you left them. There's a related detail about how people actually watched it originally that's hard to imagine now. It went out weekly. 1 hour, 1 night a week, for 13 weeks, and then nothing for a year or more. The gaps between seasons were sometimes enormous, occasionally close to 2 years, because the writer took as long as he took. So the audience sat with unresolved things for months. An episode ending on an unanswered question meant a week of speculation with colleagues. A season ending on one meant a year. That waiting was part of the experience in a way that's now almost entirely gone. People who came to it later, watching 4 episodes a night on a streaming service, are having a genuinely different experience of the same object, faster, denser, and missing the long silences that the original structure built in. Neither way is better. But it's worth noticing that the show was designed for the first one, with the pauses as part of the composition, the way rests are part of music. Let your breathing slow to match that. Nothing needs to happen quickly. Let's drift back to the therapy, because we've circled it all night, and it's where the whole thing began. The premise was, in 1999, faintly ridiculous on paper, a dangerous man on a psychiatrist's couch discussing his feelings. It sounds like a comedy sketch, and in fact there had been a comedy film with a similar setup around the same time, which is part of why the show's early press coverage kept getting the tone wrong. But what Chase understood, and what makes it hold up, is that therapy is fundamentally a storytelling device about the gap between the story a person tells and the story that's true. Every session in that series is a man narrating his own life to a professional listener, and the audience, who has just watched the actual events, sits there noticing the edits, the omissions, the self-flattery, the moments where he genuinely doesn't know he's lying. And the therapist herself is not a neutral instrument. She is compromised, gradually and terribly, by proximity to him. She finds him interesting. She finds his world glamorous in ways she is ashamed of. She goes to her own therapist to discuss what treating him is doing to her, which is one of the quiet jokes of the entire series. Everybody in this story needs somebody else to explain them to themselves, all the way up. The central question of the show, asked over and over for 8 years and never answered: can a person change? He tries. Sometimes he genuinely tries. He learns the vocabulary. He can, by the later seasons, explain his own psychological patterns quite fluently, and uses that fluency mostly to be better at getting what he wants. That's a bleak conclusion, and the show never quite commits to it either. It just keeps him in the chair, week after week, talking. Let your body get heavier now. There's nothing left to work out. There's one more idea worth turning over slowly before the night takes you, and it's about why any of this ended up mattering to people who had no interest in crime stories at all. The show arrived at a very specific moment in American life, the last months of the 20th century, a period of enormous prosperity and a peculiar low-level dread that nobody could name. And it was, underneath everything else, about decline. Every older character in it believes things used to be better. The traditions are half-remembered. The rituals are performed without belief. The younger generation is soft, distracted, uninterested in inheriting any of it. The father in the story spends 8 years mourning a way of life that, when you look closely at his own memories of it, was never as coherent as he needs it to have been. That turned out to be an unexpectedly durable subject. It's why people who don't care about the crime elements at all still find the thing unbearably moving 25 years later, because it's actually about the feeling of being the last person who remembers something and not being sure the thing was ever real. The very first line the man says to his psychiatrist in the first episode, before any of the rest of it, is that he came in feeling he'd arrived at the end of something, that the best is over. That's the thesis, stated in the first 5 minutes, and the following 8 years are just the elaboration. Let that sit there in the quiet, without needing to mean anything in particular. Before we come back round to where we started, one last stretch of quiet thinking. It's worth asking what it actually means to say a piece of television changed everything. Because the phrase gets used so loosely that it stops meaning anything at all. Here's the concrete version. Before 1999, the best writers in America wanted to write films and wrote television when they had to. After roughly 2005, a great many of them wanted to write television because television was where you could tell a story for 80 hours instead of 2, follow a character across a decade, and be strange without a studio panicking. That's a migration of talent, and it's measurable in careers rather than in opinions. Before, serious actors treated a television series as a sign that things had not gone to plan. After, they treated it as the most interesting work available. That's a change in status, and it happened within about a decade. Before, a season of television was a collection of episodes. After, it was a unit, something with a shape, written as a whole, that rewarded watching in order and punished watching out of it. That's a change in form. And before, the audience for a drama was assumed to need reassurance, that the protagonist was worth rooting for, that the world was legible, that the ending would arrive. After, an audience could be trusted with ambiguity, discomfort, and the possibility that they were being asked to enjoy the company of someone they would cross the street to avoid. Those 4 changes are what people mean. And they didn't all come from one show. The Wire was doing its own thing at the same time, and there were antecedents further back that historians of the medium will rightly point to. But this one arrived first, made money, won everything, and proved the model. And once a model is proved, everything else becomes possible. Let that rest there. Nothing to do with it. There's a melancholy attached to all of it now, 25 years on, and it's the same melancholy the show itself was about, which is a strange kind of symmetry. The people who made it talk about that period as a window that opened and then closed. The economics that made it possible have shifted. The writer has said publicly that he thinks the moment has passed. Some of the cast are gone. The industry that produced it looks very different, with different pressures and different incentives, and whether it could produce the same thing again is genuinely unclear. Which is exactly the feeling the series spent 8 years describing. A man in the middle of his life, surrounded by evidence of a better era he half remembers, trying to work out whether it was ever as good as he thinks, or whether the memory has done the work. There's something quietly funny about a show about decline becoming itself the thing people are nostalgic for, as if it wrote its own afterlife in advance. Let all of that go now. Let it get soft and far away. We started with the ducks, and it's worth going back to them, because the show does something with that image that took years for people to fully unpack. A man with a great deal of power and a great deal of money is happiest, genuinely happiest, standing in a swimming pool in a bathrobe watching some birds. He builds them a ramp. He worries about them, and when they leave, he collapses. His psychiatrist, in an early session, works out what it was about, not the ducks themselves, but what they meant to him. A family that arrived in his life, that he cared for, that he could not keep. The fear that everything he has assembled will fly off one morning without warning, and he will be standing there in the water with his arms out. It's the whole series in one image, delivered before anybody had any idea what the series was going to be. And it's a strangely comforting thing to fall asleep on, that idea, that even a person with an enormous, complicated, frightening life turns out, when you get underneath it, to be frightened of the same thing everybody is frightened of. That the people you love will go, and you won't be able to stop it. And there'll be nothing to do but stand very still in the water and watch. Let all of that loosen now. All of it. You don't need to remember the names. Not the dates, not the awards, not the arguments about the ending. None of this is a test, and there's nothing waiting for you on the other side of it. Your breathing has already slowed without you asking it to. The weight of your body has already settled into whatever's holding it up. The small tensions in the jaw and the hands and the place behind the eyes have already begun to let go. There's nothing left to follow, nowhere to be. Just the dark and the quiet and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath carrying you the rest of the way down. Just rest now, for the whole rest of the night.